Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bible Q&A. Today we're discussing, have you conquered your promised land yet? In the Old Testament, the promised land was less of a land and more of a promise. All Abraham had in Genesis chapter 12 verse 2 was the promise that he would have a son who would be the ancestor of a mighty nation. He had no idea where this mighty nation would be established until God took him there. And even then, he didn't know how they were going to deal with the people who were already living there. By the time God talked to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, Moses was witness to the mighty nation firsthand, but he still didn't know where this nation would actually live. The stories of the sons of Jacob in Canaan were fables at that point. All he knew was that he would lead Israel out of Egypt. Joshua was the first Israelite since Joseph to actually visit the land. But again, it was just a visit. There were a whole bunch of people already living there who weren't just going to leave because some Hebrew said so. Even though Joshua and the Israelites were now on the border of Canaan, there was still a lot of promise to be fulfilled before the Israelites could deal with settling the land. Throughout this gradual process, both God and the people involved took steps to make this idea reality. Abraham had intercourse with Sarah in Genesis chapter 21 verse 1, but God supernaturally made his wife fertile again. Moses led the people through the wilderness, but it was God's 10 plagues that got them out of Egypt, and the cloud and fire that got them to Canaan. Even when God just gave the city of Jericho to Joshua, he and his men still had to walk around the city a bunch of times before the walls fell. Also, as the land became more real, these biblical individuals had to overcome various challenges. Abraham had to protect his son from Canaanite influence in Genesis chapter 24 verses 6 to 8 by getting him a wife from his hometown in Mesopotamia. Moses had to deal with rebellion among the Israelites, like the one started by the 10 spies in Numbers chapter 14 and the one started by Korah in Numbers chapter 16. And of course, the biggest obstacles we associate with the story of the Promised Land are the Canaanites of Joshua's time. He and his men actually had to go out and conquer them or turn them into vassal states in order to actually settle the land. Everything I've mentioned so far has an equivalent that relates to modern Christians. So let's start from the beginning. What is our Promised Land? Well, Christ often spoke about a kingdom that he would be crowned king for. For example, he told Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence." John chapter 18 verse 36. If he said his kingdom isn't here now, it implies that the kingdom will come later. He also promised that all Christians would be unified under his leadership. He said in John, "And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd." John chapter 10 verse 16. This unification would allow him to give peace to them, according to John chapter 20 verse 21. And again, just like both God and the Old Testament figures work together to make the promise happen, both God's grace and Christians' works are required to get Christians to their version of Canaan. Grace is important because if God wasn't gracious to send Jesus Christ to die for our sins, we'd never be able to reach the promised land to begin with, according to Romans chapter 3 verse 24. On the other hand, the application of works through persecution is what helps God figure out who he can give the keys of the promised land to. As Jesus said in Revelation, "And he that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations." Revelation chapter 2 verse 26. The final element to discuss is what the modern equivalents of the Canaanites are to Christians today. Really, they represent anything that keeps Christians from God's promise, i.e. his kingdom. For example, greed is an obstacle because obsessively seeking earthly riches prevents you from obtaining the ones of God's kingdom. That's why Jesus advised, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. Matthew chapter 6 verses 19 to 20. And of course, that's why Paul told Timothy to avoid the love of money in 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10. The most important battle, however, is that against falsehood, because how can you conquer a land that you don't know how to get to? There are many different paths or lifestyles that will lead to all kinds of different destinations, and only careful study of God's map, or the Bible, will lead you to the land he has given to his followers. As John explained, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world." 1 John chapter 4 verse 1. That's our version of the cloud that took the Israelites to the land they would conquer. And that's where I'm going to stop with this episode of Bible Q&A, where we discussed what the concept of the Promised Land means to modern Christians. If you enjoyed this video, you might like to subscribe for more interesting episodes. Goodbye, everyone.